Hey there! This video is brought to you by Squarespace. If you need a website, then you should definitely check out Squarespace, and more on that later. All right, this video is going to be all about Canon's stabilization. And this is a timely video because the Canon R8 recently came out, and one of the big differences between the R8 and its bigger brother, the Canon R6 Mark II, is the fact that the R8 does not have IBIS, or an in-body image stabilization system. That's a mechanical sensor shift stabilization that you can find in cameras like the R6 Mark II. And a lot of people are wondering, can you save quite a bit of money and go with the R8 over the R6 II? Do you really need IBIS? Those sorts of things. So in this video, I'll be using the R8 and the R6 II to do a bunch of testing and compare different situations to see what the differences are. And we'll be able to make some conclusions about Canon's stabilization system in general. Now, I do want to say that nothing can replace a gimbal. And I truly mean that. If you need a gimbal for the types of shots that you need, there's really no other replacement for using a gimbal. But there are some situations in which the in-camera stabilization can be handy, and I know a lot of you out there use it for a lot of different kinds of situations. In this video, I want to be just talking about how the stabilization works for shooting video, as I really don't cover photography on the channel. So again, we'll be just focusing on shooting video. Now, both the R8 and the R6 Mark II have an electronic stabilization system, and there are 3 settings: either off, on, or enhanced. The on and the enhanced both crop in, so you need to be aware of that, and the enhanced crops in more than just the on setting. As I said before, the R6 Mark II has IBIS, and there is a weird quirk in the Canon mirrorless cameras. So if you have a lens that has stabilization and you turn the lens stabilization on, it also turns the IBIS on. If you turn the lens stabilization off, it turns the IBIS off. There is no way to have lens on, IBIS off, or IBIS on and lens off. It's either both on or both off. It's a very weird quirk. I wish they would change this, but we have to realize that and work with it. Now, one thing that's great is that in this video, I'll be using the R8, which doesn't have IBIS, so I can test out like lens stab with digital stab. I can do lots of different combinations. And I'm going to be doing a lot of comparison tests at different focal lengths throughout this video so you can really see the differences. Now, I can't do every possible comparison out there, but I did a lot, and I think we'll be able to make some really good conclusions based on those tests. I also want to point out that all lenses have different quality stabilization, and their ability to work with the Canon mirrorless system will vary quite a bit. So during this test, I'll be using the lenses that I own, which are the RF 15-35, 24-70, and 100-500. Now, these are Canon's most expensive RF-L zooms. So if you're using some of the more inexpensive RF lenses, or maybe some of the primes, maybe some third-party options or older EF glass, your mileage may vary, but I just want to let you know that I'll be using these lenses in this video to do the testing. So the first test to look at here will be the vlogging test, and I'll be using the RF 15-35 at 15 millimeters, and I'll be holding the camera by the lens, so no little gorilla pod or tripod or anything like that, and I'll just be walking with the camera, just not even being super careful, just to really show you what's going on with the vlogging test. All right, so we'll start off by taking a look at the R8 with no stabilization whatsoever. We have lens stabilization off and digital stabilization off. So first, let's turn the digital stabilization on, and this is still with lens stab off. You can see that it makes it a little bit smoother, but my footsteps are pretty heavy. I wouldn't say this looks very smooth. And then when we have the digital turned to enhanced, this is what it looks like. So cropped in quite a bit more. Now let's turn the lens stab on. This is with digital off. And you can see that it smooths it out quite a bit, but my footsteps still look pretty heavy. And then this is with the digital stabilization turned on. So it looks a little bit smoother. And lastly, we'll have lens on with digital enhanced. And this is looking pretty smooth. Again, I see some vibrations in the background with my footsteps. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest differences between the R8 and the R6 Mark II, having to do with the IBIS system, is really when the camera is moving. All right, so taking a look here at lens stab off and on, you can see on the left and the right here, as I cycle through the different digital stabilizations, there is quite a big difference, in my opinion, with the lens stabilization on. So this is with the digital on, and then lastly, with the digital turned to enhanced. You can see it actually looks pretty solid with the lens stab on with digital enhanced. So there's a huge difference, in my opinion, between using the lens stab on and lens stab off. So I really recommend that if you're going to be vlogging with the Canon R8, that you have a lens that has stabilization. Now taking a look at the vlogging test from the Canon R6 Mark II. This is with no stabilization whatsoever to give you a baseline. Once we turn the lens and IBIS on, it looks quite a bit smoother, although a lot of people are critical about the wobbles in the corners on the IBIS system with wide-angle lenses. But once we turn the digital stabilization on, I think it does a pretty good job about taming those wobbles. It's not completely gone, but it's a lot better. And then once digital enhanced is turned on, I think it looks really, really smooth. Of course, you're giving up quite a bit of real estate with the crop there, but it does look smooth and a lot of the footsteps are taken out. And in my opinion, The lens IBIS combo with the digital enhance does give you really smooth footage. And I think if you are going to be doing a lot of handheld vlogging and walking around like this, I find that the R6 Mark II definitely looks smoother than the R8. Before we get on to the next test, I need to take a moment to talk about this video's sponsor, which is Squarespace. If you're a creative, a content creator, or a small business owner, you need a website. Believe me, you really do. Now, I'm really excited to have Squarespace sponsor this video because I've been personally using Squarespace for years. Your website can be as simple as a landing spot for people to find your contact info and social media, but it's also a great way to show off your photos, videos, portfolio, artwork, etc. They even let you host videos directly. There is no need to link a YouTube or Vimeo video, and it looks a lot more professional and seamless. It's simple to set up a website with their amazing templates. They make it super easy, and anyone can do it pretty quickly. They have lots of other cool stuff like the ability to set up an online store, schedule appointments, or have member areas. You should definitely head over to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/JoshSatin to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Link in description. So now let's get on to doing some static tests of just holding the camera, and we'll do this at various focal lengths. So the way I was doing this test, I was just holding the camera out in front of me like this as best as I could. I do not have very steady hands. I had quite a bit of shake to the camera, as you guys will see. So this will be a good test to see how well these cameras do in all of these different situations. So starting off with the Canon R8 at 50 millimeters, this is with no stabilization on whatsoever. Then once we add the digital stabilization set to on, you can see it makes it a little bit smoother, but there are definitely a bunch of micro jitters. And when you put the digital to enhanced, again, it crops in quite a bit, as you can see here. It's looking okay, but again, it's just full of micro jitters. I don't think the stabilization takes out the micro jitters. So now I turn the lens stabilization on, and you can see how much smoother it is. So the lens stabilization, as you can see, makes a huge difference. Once you turn the digital stabilization on top of the lens, it's looking pretty smooth. And then lastly, when we take a look with the enhanced, it's looking pretty good. I wouldn't say it's solid as a tripod, but you could easily apply some stabilization there and make it look really good. So again, taking a look here at the difference between lens stabilization off on the left and lens stabilization on the right as we cycle through the digital stabilization options, you can see that having lens stabilization makes quite a difference, and it gets pretty steady with digital on and even a little bit steadier with the digital enhanced. So for a static shot at 50 millimeters, I think when you have lens stabilization, you're in good shape. Now onto the R6 Mark II at 50 millimeters, and this is with no stabilization. And once we turn the lens and IBIS on, you'll notice that it's looking a lot more solid. Of course, the lens stabilization does quite a bit. This is with digital off. And once we add digital on, then it crops in a little bit and it's looking really steady. And lastly, we'll look at the digital stabilization set to enhanced. Again, cropped in a little bit more, but it's looking really good here. And lastly, let's compare the R6 Mark II and the R8 to take a look and see if the IBIS is helping us out. And frankly, I don't see much of a difference between the two systems here with the lens stabilization on the R8. And I think this is more of a testament to how good the lens stabilization is in the Canon RF lenses, especially the one I tested there, which was the 24-70. So I really didn't see too much of a difference in a static shot at 50 millimeters. Now let's take a look at 135 millimeters on the RF 100-500, starting out with the Canon R8. This is no stabilization. Here is with the digital stabilization turned on, and you can see those micro jitters are a little bit more enhanced than they were at 50 millimeters. Of course, we're at a longer focal length here. And the digital enhanced mode, it just sort of amplifies the micro jitters because it's just zoomed in a little bit. The digital doesn't really help that much. But once you turn the lens stabilization on, it does help quite a bit. Of course, we're not going to look like a tripod here, but it does help stabilize it quite a bit and get rid of a lot of those micro jitters. And as you crop in, it does start to help a little bit more, but it also is zoomed in a little bit more. So the big difference here is the lens stab, and here is with digital enhanced. Looking pretty good for 135 millimeters handheld without IBIS. So again, taking a look at the effect of lens stabilization as we did before, you can see here with digital turned off, the lens stabilization on the left, the no lens stabilization on the right. And here's with digital on. Again, you see a huge difference here and the benefits of having lens stabilization. And lastly, digital enhanced. You can see the difference there. I'd say the one on the left is pretty good. I think a little bit of stabilization in post would make that very acceptable. Now taking a look at the R6 Mark II at 135 millimeters with the 100-500, starting off with no stabilization whatsoever. Then turning the lens and IBIS on, and it already looks really good. So again, the power of the lens stabilization and the IBIS here looking great. Once we turn the digital stabilization on, it is looking pretty solid here and no real complaints there. And then adding in the digital enhanced, I think it looks a little bit better. Again, you can see that it does crop in quite a bit, but looking really good for handheld video. And lastly, taking a look at the R6 Mark II versus the R8. You can see the differences here. I'd say maybe the R6 Mark II looks a little better, but pretty similar at this distance. I wouldn't really give a clear advantage to either one. And I think, again, this really shows the strength of the stabilization system that are in the Canon lenses, like in that example, the RF 100 to 500. Now let's go on talking about some really telephoto stuff. Let's zoom all the way into 500 millimeters. And for this, I was actually holding the camera up to my eye because that's how I usually shoot when I'm handheld at 500 millimeters. So first, taking a look at the Canon R8 at 500 millimeters, you can see there is quite a bit of shake here with no stabilization whatsoever. But once we start adding the digital stabilization, you can see it almost amplifies it like we saw at 135 millimeters. The shakes and jitters are pretty bad. And really, the digital enhanced doesn't really make much of a difference here. It just crops in a little bit more. So, but once we turn the lens stabilization on, you can see how well that pulls it together. It is not rock solid, but definitely takes out a lot of the shakes, and it's actually pretty remarkable. Here's what it is with digital stabilization turned on, maybe just slightly better. And lastly, the digital enhanced. So looking pretty good, considering there's no IBIS and we're at 500 millimeters handheld. And again, just like I did before, let's take a look at lens stabilization on the left, lens stabilization off on the right. You can see as we cycle through the stabilization settings, the lens stab makes a huge difference. Really, the digital stabilization is not doing much at those long telephoto distances. And you can see with the enhanced, really not much of a difference there. So again, lens stabilization is super important on the R8. Taking a look now here at the R6 Mark II at 500 millimeters handheld with no stabilization, just to see where we're starting from. Then when we add the lens and IBIS stabilization, it looks really, really good. I'm always impressed about how good the lens and IBIS stabilization is in the R6 II. Adding digital stabilization with the on setting, you can see it smooths it out just a little bit more. Looking pretty good here. And then lastly, when we add the enhanced stabilization, you can see it's looking really, really solid. Pretty amazing what it can do at 500 millimeters with the stabilization in the R6 II. And lastly, let's compare the R8 versus the R6 II. I definitely think the R6 II has an advantage here at these longer focal lengths. I think that it looks a little bit smoother and a little bit less nervous, both in the on and digital enhanced modes. So I personally use the R6 Mark II with the RF 100 to 500 a lot when I'm out shooting wildlife. And I find I can get some really stable footage by just holding the camera up to my eye and using the EVF, getting a third point of contact. And once you can take down your computer and add a little bit of stabilization in post, you can get a pretty stable image. Now, of course, when I'm out shooting, if there's something I can lean on or I can crouch down or something like that to get a little bit more stable, I will. But often I can stabilize it pretty well in post. So take a look here. This is some footage at 500 millimeters. This is the lens and IBIS on with the digital on. And then when I bring in the computer and stabilize it in Final Cut Pro, this is what it looks like. Now, Final Cut does not have the best stabilization out there, but you can see how well you can stabilize the footage. So I also want to take a look and see how this stabilization works in APS-C crop mode. And that what it is a 1.6 times crop. So if you're shooting at 500 millimeters with the APS-C crop mode turned on, you'll be at 800 millimeters. So taking a look here at the R6 Mark II, this is at an 800 millimeter full frame equivalent. This is with the lens and IBIS on, digital off. This is with the digital on. And you can see how stable this is. This is pretty incredible. This is essentially 800 millimeters and actually further once the digital enhance is turned on. Handheld video, not stabilizing the computer. All right, so that was a lot of testing, but I wanted to include all that footage so that you could make your own opinions and, of course, go back and check them out again if you need to. But let me give you my takeaways and conclusions. First of all, the lens stabilization is very important in the Canon ecosystem. Not only is it important, but it works really, really well. So the stabilization in these RF zoom lenses that I showed you, I was really impressed with. Like I said before, if you're using other RF lenses, maybe some third-party options or some older EF lenses, your mileage may vary and you might have worse performance in terms of stabilization. The digital stabilization really didn't take out the micro jitters, and I found that at the longer focal lengths, it almost amplified it as it punched in. So you want to be really careful about using digital stabilization for stuff like that. In terms of the IBIS, which is the big question, I do think the IBIS really does help out a lot when the camera's moving, like in the vlogging tests, and also at the much longer focal lengths. If you're doing static shots, sort of in that middle range, the lens stab plus the digital stabilization worked really, really well, and there wasn't a huge difference in that middle range for a static shot. So overall, is this good enough for you to use the R8 and not have IBIS? That's really up to you. For me personally, I would like to have IBIS for those other advantages, but there is a big price difference between the R8 and the R6 Mark II, and I think a lot of people are curious about how well this system matched up to the R6 Mark II. So it's going to be up to you to figure out if you can get away with not having IBIS. But remember, nothing replaces a gimbal. So if you need a gimbal for your shots, make sure you're using a gimbal. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Big thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Thank you for watching. Please hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.